You're listening to Artistic Finance, show 192. On today's show, we talk with lighting designer Jane Cox about life as a freelance theater designer who has also taken on some full-time academic work. We discuss parenting while working in the arts, awareness of the financial system working against theater design as a career, paying student loans with a credit card, prioritizing the needs of the community above the market rate, and Jane's tax rate as a freelancer being up to 50% and having that go down once she started working a full-time W-2 job. It didn't come up in the interview, but I want to mention that Jane has a Tony Award and a Drama Desk Award for last year's work lighting the play Appropriate. And she also has 3 other Tony nominations. And speaking of the Tonys, the 2025 Tony Awards were held this week. And I have to mention that our previous podcast guest, Paul Tazwell, was awarded the Tony Award for Best Costume Design of a Musical for Death Becomes Her. That's his second Tony Award, the first being for Hamilton. Now, before we jump in, I do want to mention that I am looking for investors for an off-Broadway play this September. I need to raise $50,000 by August, which is right around the corner. Now, I'll talk more about this at the end of the episode, so if you are at all interested in dipping your toe into the off-Broadway theater investing world, stick around after the interview. Today's interview is in 2 parts. The first hour is today, and the second hour will come out in a future episode. If you are a patron of Artistic Finance, you already have access to the full interview in your podcast feed. Now, part of the reason I split today's episode up is because a patron listened to the early release of the interview and mentioned that there is so much good information in it that it would be a good idea to split it in 2 so that it's easier to digest. There's less a chance that people will listen for an hour and then need to go off and do something and forget to return. And I will admit that 2 hours listening to one of these episodes is asking a lot. But if you listen to this hour and you really love it, which I do, and I think you'll pick that up during the interview, we had a wonderful time. But if you want to hear the rest, you can certainly do that by going to our Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/artisticfinance, and sign up there to access the full thing. Links to everything we discuss, including every name that Jane mentions, that is all in the show notes or at artisticfinance.com/192. Without further ado, let's get to the show.
You are listening to Artistic Finance, where we help creatives learn about the business of show business.
Welcome, and thank you for listening. I am your host, Ethan Steimel, broadcasting from Lake St. Louis, Missouri. We are recording this June 3rd, 2025, and the latest theater news is that the Tony Awards are happening this Sunday, so by the time you hear this, they will have just wrapped up, and I hope that everybody nominated gets an award. That's my hope. I hope it works out.
Oh, I hope so too. They all deserve it.
Exactly. All right, and today I welcome lighting designer Jane Cox to the show. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I've really been enjoying listening to your podcast.
Oh, man, you're amazing. So first off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Jane. I am a lighting designer. I'm an educator. I'm an administrator and creative producer at Princeton University as well. And a wife and a mom to a newly teenage human being. And I got into lighting design because I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. I think it's a fair assessment. I'm interested in everything, and I'm still interested in everything. So I am lucky enough that I sometimes get to do lighting for Broadway shows, but that's a pretty small piece of my life, a meaningful but small piece of my life. At the moment, I am working on a project with an engineer and a composer called Rhythmbot. So I'm lighting robots, and I'm running the Fund for Irish Studies at Princeton, and I'm on the Council of Science and Technology there, and I'm going to go teach a seminar in Copenhagen. So lighting shows is sort of the central, but maybe not the most time-consuming piece of my life at the moment. That said, it's the central piece of my life. That's what I've been doing for my whole career, is lighting things. So
yeah. Like if I have to have a label, that's the easiest one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it won't confuse anyone if they see it. Yeah, because Linda Essig is an educator, but she wrote
Yes.
books on lighting, and so she's moved on from lighting. But everybody knows her as a lighting designer. So if you introduce her as something else, to me, it's weird.
Yes. Once a lighting designer, always a lighting designer.
Exactly. I also love that you said newly teenage person, because in your bio,
Yes.
it says, and so far they have shown no interest in going into theater.
That's correct. I think it's a parenting win that my daughter now feels warmly about theater, I will say. And I don't know if you will have this experience, but to some extent, theater was the enemy earlier on, because theater was the thing that took me away for days or weeks at a time. So,
I mean, yeah, it is the enemy. And I'm mostly a stay-at-home dad right now.
Amazing.
It wasn't like that at the beginning, and I think soon it's not going to be that way anymore.
Yeah.
And parenting, to me, is very hard.
It is. I mean, for sure, going to the theater to do a tack when you have a 2-year-old, it's different when you have a 13-year-old. But, but when you have a 2-year-old, definitely going to tack is easier. It's easier.
Well, I did a summer stock when he was 3 months old. It was at a university, and one of the professors, who wasn't even involved, but they just came for a rehearsal, and they were just talking with me, and they said, I'm not going to tell you not to work, but I wish my daughter, who's now 18 or something, I wish I hadn't worked as much choreographing and directing and all that. That sort of stuck with me, and I was like, he caught me in a very vulnerable moment where I am exhausted.
3 months.
And so I've taken like a year to be a stay-at-home dad, and it is
beautiful.
I know that time is wrapping up, but it has been a really good choice, I think.
That's wonderful. Oh, and so important just in terms of sort of bonding, like starting that relationship. I mean, I will say one of the best things about the fact that I was sometimes gone for, weeks at a time in those early years has meant that my husband, from early on, had a kind of fully bonded relationship with our daughter. So it's very equal parenting now. Like over the years, and this is about money for sure, over the years, we've sort of flowed back and forth between who is more of the primary caregiver and who isn't. But that's been a real gift, because we both have really tight relationships with her. Say that now. She's just 13. Let's see where we are in a couple of years.
I know. I feel so bonded right now at 2 years old, but I'm like, but he's not the teenager yet. And so I hope it can last.
It will. It just gets better. That's what I think.
I love it. Jane, your creative personality here, what is a live event that you like to experience as an audience member?
Are you going to, okay, I'm not going to do the whole parenting thing for the entire episode, but we are going to the middle school orchestra concert tonight. And I have always been an enormous enthusiast for arts events with children in them. Any children. My children, great. Other people's children, awesome. Like choirs, orchestras, music, especially with kids in it. So there's that. This is hard for me to pick one, because remain a kind of equal opportunity enthusiast, but I also have a great fondness for the Irish session. I actually play in a small Irish session, and I love to go to like really good one in a pub. So that's something that makes me happy. Yeah, so it's like Irish traditional music, and a session is when like a group of musicians get together. In Ireland, it happens in a pub. I grew up in Ireland, and the musicians just kind of get together in the corner of the room and start playing. And then there's an etiquette to it, but if you know what you're doing, you can also join in. So it's not exclusive usually to the local community. Like if you have an instrument and you know some tunes, you can join in. So that's a really kind of communal form of art making I love.
Okay, so I read in your bio that you studied flute.
I did.
So I just need to know the truth here, Jane. Do you
Yeah.
ever go to an Irish pub where you think there might be a session happening and just stick a flute in your bag as you're on the way there?
You know, I'm working my way up to being that person. I learned, even though I grew up in Ireland, I learned classical flute. And I recently, just this year, bought a traditional Irish flute, which you really have to have if you're going to go play in a session, with the kind of fantasy in the back of my head that someday, I will be that person.
That's amazing. All right, that day is coming. All right, now you're a financial personality. Are you good, bad, or neutral with money?
I mean, I feel like, okay, first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast, because I had to think about some of these things, and I would say it has sort of traditionally been part of my identity that I'm terrible with money. I now have a full-time job at Princeton, which makes that much easier. It was not great being terrible at money as a freelance lighting designer.
How long have you had the full-time gig?
This is actually my 9th year. But, prior to that, I had never held a full-time job, outside of sort of summer jobs or whatever. And, but I'd never held kind of a full-time job that didn't have an end date to it before.
Totally. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that admission right up front.
Yeah. So, when you asked me, I was like, am I ready to bear this part of my life to the public world? But I'm here. I'm ready. You can think of it as a therapy session.
Just so you know, this isn't live. So anytime, if you say anything that you're uncomfortable with later,
okay,
it's so easy to take it out or start over, anything like that. So
okay, that's great. Good to know. Good to know.
You can let your guard down and then say,
amazing.
Actually, I shouldn't have left my guard down.
Probably shouldn't have let that one out. Yeah. Okay, great.
Amazing. All right. So let's go back before your lighting career.
Yeah.
Growing up, did you have good financial examples to learn from?
So I'm going to say my parents did a very good job, but the context was so completely different to America that it was all but useless. So my parents, they're retired and they're living in their retirement, but they're living on a state pension. Growing up in Ireland in the 70s and into the 80s, as I started to leave the country, money started to come into it. See where I go, the money goes the other direction. But when I was a kid in Ireland, there just really wasn't any money in the country. So what was really positive about growing up in Ireland is I'm not going to say there wasn't income inequality, but it's a completely different universe than here. My parents did perfectly fine. We grew up with little money, but we had the sense of being totally fine. We never had to worry about putting food on the table. We never had to worry about, my parents bought a house. God forbid, you can't buy a house in Dublin now. But at the time, my parents could buy a house on like fairly entry-level academic job, one job. Yeah. So my parents did great, but it's not applicable to arriving in sort of capitalist America. And it took me a long time to understand how kind of maladapted I was to figuring out how to survive here. And I remember signing the piece of paper, where I was basically saying, yes, I will take out $50,000 to go to NYU grad school, and thinking like, surely they don't think I'm going to be able to pay this back. Like, and sort of not fully understanding the social context in which, of course, they didn't think I could pay it back. They were counting on the fact that I wouldn't be able to, and I would have to pay my student loans back at enormously high interest rates. but I wasn't adjusted to, financial ways of thinking that are more appropriate to this country.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I like that assessment of the loans. And also, your parents, and it's not parents are responsible for so much.
Yeah.
It's like, and there's so much to finance that's like they couldn't possibly teach you. But even if you have a parent who teaches you, really good stuff about finance or is a really good example, even if you did have that, going into a career as a freelancer.
Yes, that's right.
That's also not applicable in a way.
That's absolutely right. And now that I'm back in a full-time job, I mean, all the key things other than food come out of my paycheck before I see it. Even the mortgage. I have a mortgage now. The mortgage payment, the health insurance, the retirement, the taxes, all those things come out of my paycheck before I see it. And I can do that, I can balance a budget in that scenario. I think the freelancing in this country with the number of things that you are then responsible for is really tricky.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
All right. So then at the start of your career, when, all this information that you may have learned was not applicable, what did your finances look when you started out?
Oh, like terrible. I mean, and they went on being pretty terrible until I took a full-time job when I was 45. I didn't stress out about it that much. I think it mattered enormously to me to be in the arts. And I knew going in that was sort of financial madness. I did not have the illusion that some people seem to have that possibly it's sort of a career. And I remember I actually went on Cory Pattak's podcast, and I think I basically said, well, it's not really a career. I mean, you can't expect to make a living at it. And I remember him being like, what are you talking about? Of course it's a career. But, I still think what I say to my students, which is that you can make a career in lighting, but the idea that you can make a career in the not-for-profit theater field is a little bit like saying I want to be a novelist or I want to be a painter, which is that you have to know it's more of a way of life than it is a career that can be reliably navigated in any way.
I'm so glad you said that because I went on the Light Talk podcast and I said you can't make a career as a theatrical lighting designer except for the few outliers.
Yeah.
But then even them, I said, not all their work is in the theater.
Correct.
So, and then
I correct. Everyone who's listening, he is correct.
But there was, I listened to that podcast as well. And so in the following weeks, they had some people write in and say, we disagree with Ethan because there's all these examples of theatrical designers. And I wasn't able to go and correct them.
Right.
But I was like, for a while, I was like, maybe I am wrong. There are a lot of people that work in theater. But I'm going to say what you're saying. You can make a career in lighting.
Yes, absolutely. You can make a lucrative career in lighting. So by all means, go to school for lighting design. I mean, you can make a career in lighting design. You just can't be attached to the bit where you make a career in the theater. That's a different thing altogether. And I feel that I can say this with some authority.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like there are things I can't say because I don't have the authority. Like, I've never lit a show on Broadway. I've never had a commercially successful show, but you have, and you're saying these things.
Yeah, I think when I was in grad school, I went to NYU for grad school, which I loved, but I didn't, in my mind, and now I think, oh my God, there's so many ways in which I was so ignorant. In my mind, I was like, look at all these people on the faculty making a living doing theater design. And not once did I think then, oh, actually, they have a full-time job at NYU. Because their identity as a designer was the bit that stuck out to me at the time, So I was like, you can do this.
Well, and that's like a issue with labeling too, because we've labeled you as a lighting designer, but you're saying, oh, there's so much more to me. and I feel like that it's just like if you're a priest or a preacher, and it's like you have to identify, so you can't identify with anything else, or it's a struggle to be like, well, I'm a priest, but I'm really good at like video games and I'm in these tournaments and I'm like this super successful video game person.
Right. Yeah. Or poets, I mean, clearly you can't make a living as a poet, but actually there are quite a lot of people who make a life as poets with, residencies and teaching jobs, and sort of poetry is the identity that allows them to build a career. And I would say like lighting design has been the sort of identity that has allowed, it's been the entryway, the doorway into a lot of things.
Well, and also picking back off of what you said about the professors that had their full-time gig, but you identified them as a theater designer.
Right.
So I am in interviewing for an academic job. And the salary is very low.
Oh.
And I'll just say what it is, $60,000 a year.
Yeah.
And it's like for a full-time job, $60,000. Right. It's fine. Right. It is what it is. But in the interview process, we were talking about that, and the person hiring who controls what you get paid, like if it, because I was like, can it go higher than that? And it was a firm no. But the consolation, he said, was, but you can work outside of the university and go do shows and things.
You were like, yeah, such a lucrative, yeah.
Which is fine, but it's like that shouldn't be the selling point of like, well, our pay is low, but we allow you to go, work week-long texts and earn money other ways. It was just sort of weird to me. But.
Absolutely. And something else I say to my students is, and the problem is not the theater or academia. The problem is the system, the economic structure of the country that doesn't value those things. And, that is on some level invested in a large proportion of its members not having enough money.
100%. Totally agree.
So I wish you had this podcast when I was 25. Although honestly, I think I would have been too scared to listen to it, because I also think I've always been really intimidated by money, because I always thought, that's scary, because if I really think about that, then I would stop being in the not-for-profit art. So I can't really look at it, because if I look at it properly, I'll have to stop doing this.
I totally agree with you. And I also wish other people would, like more people would listen to this, because I know a lot of people are zero interested. It's like, we want to focus on the art, not that part of it, for the same reasons you're saying.
Fear. That's fear speaking.
Yeah. But we talk about the same stuff over and over and over again, because the basics are the basics. Like, it's not complicated. You just need to like at least know. So,
yeah.
Okay. But let me help me understand. Okay, Irish accent, born in Ireland. You came here. Was NYU, after that graduation, was that the start of your career, or did you have career before that?
No. So I actually went to college in London, and I did a junior year abroad at UMass Amherst, which was fantastic. And I met an amazing lighting professor called Penny Remsen, who just retired, who also taught Ben Stanton and Justin Townsend and Tracy Planer, a whole lot of really great lighting designers. Anyway, I spent my junior year there, and it was actually in America where I was like, maybe if I do lighting, I can make a life in the arts in which I can survive, because I was getting paid, I think, $8 an hour. But this was like in 1992, 91. $8 an hour was like a decent amount of money to work as an electrician. And I enjoyed it. And I was making money at it. And that was the first time where I thought, I could be in the art making side of the arts. I think I always assumed that eventually I would have to get a job as like an arts, maybe administration or somehow outside of the making piece. And it was being in Massachusetts, where at the time there were some theaters there that don't exist anymore, like Stage West in Springfield. And you could make money like as a programmer, as a board op, lugging cables around.
So then you did your junior year there, and then you went back and graduated, and then came to NYU?
Soon. No, then I moved back. I met a cute boy at UMass Amherst. We got married, and we lived we lived in Northampton, Massachusetts for a year after we both graduated, undergrad at the same time, him in America, me in England. And we lived there for a year, and I lit DJ Dennis's Top 40 at the Pearl Street nightclub. And they had Pearl Street nightclub also had small bands come through, so I lit bands. So I had like a job at the local club, which was one of my first paid lighting jobs. And then he decided he wanted to be an actor, and he got a full ride to Temple. So we went to Philadelphia. Speaking of like dumb financial moves, we got there. He was worse he's not my current husband. He was lovely. He was worse with money than me. We got to Philadelphia. We had, put down the deposit on an apartment. And all this happened like in person, in real time, unlike today, because, no internet. And then we had $30 left. And he thought he was going to get his check from the university, like, as soon as they started. And when he got there, they said, oh, no, that comes at the end of September. And we had $30. So I got a waitressing job that day. I lied through my teeth. I said I had done silver service waitressing, which I absolutely had not, and got a job that day that like paid in cash. So I had a number of experiences like that where I was like, oh, I can make this work. We can show up and have $30 in our pocket, and then we'll figure out how to eat, So for most of my 20s, I had that sort of attitude to it.
That is amazing. And I'm stressed out going back in time to that moment.
Which I think on some level is based on having grown up kind of middle class in Ireland. Like there was no money there, but there wasn't a core anxiety the way there's a core anxiety here that now I have, that like, oh, fuck, like if you can't, nobody else is going to help you if you can't, find the money for the rent. But anyway, in my 20s, I was like, whatever, someone will pay me to do something. And they always did. So, but, often we would get close to the end of the month and there would be $0 in the bank account.
So after Philadelphia, where did you go from there?
So then I got a job I'm lying about the full-time job. I had a full-time job briefly at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania on the technical crew. In that job, I met Clifton Taylor, who came through as the lighting director for Lar Lubavitch. And we were cutting gels together in the basement. That's how long ago it was. And he said, you should think about grad school. And I had briefly thought about it because that's what my husband was doing. And he recommended NYU. So I applied to Yale and NYU. I didn't get into Yale. And I did get into NYU, so I went.
Okay, you and I have that in common, that I also applied to Yale and did not get in.
Didn't get in. I've never let them forget it.
Well, yeah, there's like this Yale mafia, they call it, and I am part of the didn't get into Yale mafia.
Let's start a new mafia that didn't get into Yale mafia.
Amazing, yeah. Well,
Awesome.
With you as our president, I've just elected you president.
Amazing.
So you're a good person to have as president. So this is a pretty powerful mafia so far.
Amazing. It's become a kind of running joke in my life, not having gotten into Yale. So I'd be happy to take on that mantle. And in fact, the first show I did out of grad school didn't go very well. And the person who was directing it and was the artistic director was also friends with Jennifer Tipton. And, both I was young and I didn't really know what I was doing. And she was young, the director, and a new mom and very stressed out and painting the sets as well as designing them. And she got really freaked out by the lighting. And she asked her friend Jennifer Tipton to come sit in the theater with me to help. Which actually, it was sort of like horrendous. But at the same time, Jennifer Tipton behaved so graciously. She sat there for a while and then she leaned over and she said, can I help you in any way? And I was like, well, if you have any suggestions, I'd be happy to take them. And she said, I think you're doing fine. So I'm also grateful to her for that. But that's my Jennifer Tipton in my mind.
Okay, when you write your book or a book or any book, you should put that quote in. I think you're doing just fine, Jennifer Tipton.
Oh, yeah, that's nice.
That's amazing. Okay, well, it sounds like now that you have a full-time gig that you don't think or worry about money on a daily basis. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. I still, I mean, it's definitely true in the sense that, as long as we have this job, which pays much better than the job that you're applying for. Sorry to say that. I mean, we'll see for how long, right? I mean, the Ivy League schools are maybe at this moment in time under the gun a little bit. So we'll see. But for the time being, it's definitely a comfortable paycheck. We didn't start putting money away for retirement prior to that. So I kind of find myself doing the same thing with retirement that I did earlier in my career with things like taxes, which was kind of looking at it and then going like, looking quickly in the opposite direction, So I have to figure that one out.
Okay, but this sounds like a good story. So you're saying that 9 years ago when you took this job, that's when you started saving for retirement.
Correct. And I don't think that's to be recommended. I hope my mother doesn't listen to this podcast or my daughter. They probably will.
I don't want to out your age, but I think
No, I'm happy. I'm 54. So I'm 9 years. I took this job at 45 and my agent said to me, "You're too young. You're too young to take a full-time job. You got a lot of Broadway shows. You should do that. You can't do a lot of Broadway shows with a full-time job," which is true. You can't. And I was like, I think you're wrong about that. I think I'm kind of late to be having a proper income. So
I only wanted to bring up your age because at age 50, you can start contributing extra to your IRAs.
Okay.
And I think to your 401ks.
Yeah.
You don't have to, certainly, but...
But you should. But you should. Well, luckily, Princeton has already a generous retirement program. And I started paying in quite a lot of money every month, which gets taken out before I ever see it from my Princeton paycheck towards retirement. So, if I can stay, I'm not in a tenured position. So, but if I can stay in this job for another, I don't know, 15 years, I should be able to catch up. That's the hope. But I'm very, the more I understand, which is still pretty minimal, but the more that I do understand about retirement, the more grateful I am actually to the union's pension that is real. I mean, that's, it's not a huge amount of money, but it comes every month until you're dead. And nobody has that anymore. I'm not sure if people in the union, if how many designers in the union really appreciate like how unusual that is in this country now.
I have never heard anyone complain about the union pension.
Yeah, good. And you've heard a lot of people talk about money, so.
Yeah, everyone is super happy with it.
It's great. Thank you, USAA 29. We appreciate you.
For all the complaints that we have with our life and all that, that is one thing that people are always happy to say, like, USA pension is wonderful. So I didn't put money away towards retirement, but I worked under union contracts for 20 years and there's a pretty decent amount in there. So that's worth something. That's awesome. All right. So today, do you have any debts like student loans or medical debt or credit card debt?
I do not have, we have a mortgage, which will never pay off. But it's still cheaper than the rent was. So I feel okay about that. And we still owe a little bit on our car, but we don't have credit card debt, medical debt, student loan debt. I had to get out of my student loan debt via my mother, though. We made an arrangement. I really struggled to get out from under student loan debt. And because when I started having to pay my student loans back, I was not a citizen. I didn't feel like it was an option to default on them, which is what many of my classmates from NYU did, to be honest, because we all took loans out at like 8.5% with no idea of what that meant. And I put my student loan payments on a credit card for more than a decade. Stupid thing to do. Don't do that. And eventually, I sold my student loan debt from the American government to my mother. And she took out a chunk of her pension, actually, to pay it off. And then I paid her back at a much lower interest rate. So I'm very grateful to her for that. But otherwise, I would never have gotten out from under that.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm so happy that your mother did that. That is so cool.
I know, right? Really cool. And a really generous piece of parenting.
Wow. Well, and also you were saying you had loans at 8%. So people my age, I'm 37, we have all have student loans.
Yeah.
But we got them at a much lower interest rate, like 1, 2, 3%, because just of how the economy was for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
But now they are back up to what you're saying, like they're between 6 and 9% now.
It's brutal. Well, and I went back at the time and I did the math on how much I had actually paid back on my it was about $50,000, but when all was said and done, when I graduated from NYU, which, I got 2 years where I didn't pay tuition on a scholarship. So a lot of people owed a lot more. I owed about 50 when I left, and I paid back more than 100 without the principal really ever going down. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a racket.
It's a racket.
Throughout your life and career, have you ever used a budget?
Yes, many times. Oh, many times. Like when, I'd be like, how is it that it's almost the end of the month and, we don't have enough money for next month, or I don't, or we don't, have enough money for whatever it is. Very meticulous budgets from several times in my life. So, sometimes I think maybe it's not fair to say exactly so much as I'm terrible with money, so much as like it's a terrible career for money. And if you insist on continuing to do it, then you can be said to be terrible with money. But it's not because I don't understand math, it's just, it's really hard to survive as a freelancer in this field.
That's such a good way to put it. That really is. All right. So talking about being good with money or being good with math, what is a good financial thing that you have done that other people could learn from or perhaps emulate?
Okay, so this is going to be good advice for you at this current phase of your life. I think one of the smarter things I've ever done is really try to figure out what it costs to live in an area that I was living in, and then pay my assistants or babysitters. I think this is even more crucial with babysitters, a living wage. And anywhere I've ever lived, the living wage has been more than the going rate. And so that has been a smart financial decision because it's good for the universe. But it is also a smart financial decision because people are aware that you're taking their needs into account when you're employing them. So I try not to be the employer that I have had, if that makes sense. I've had some great employers, but I've also had a lot of people who never considered, who were like, the numbers I should use are what is the going rate? And I'm like, what does that mean? No, what matters is how much does it cost to live? I mean, that does not factor in how big are your student loans, how much other things are you paying for. But there is a sort of base number for a young person in New York City, let's say. I'm not gonna, it's been 9 years since I lived there, so I'm not going to guess at what that is right now. But I have always tried to do the math and understand, what does it mean to be able to eat, pay your rent, and have health insurance, not live a glamorous life, but and then pay people that, even if you can't afford to. And I think that's the right thing to do. I have heard people say to me, it's not great when you pay above the going rate because it pushes the going rate up for everybody. But I disagree with that. And that has been good over the years because that has helped build a network of people in my life, I think, who understand that kind of other people's needs or that aspect of community is important for me.
I love that you just said that because it sounds anti-financial for personal finances. But the thing about pushing the going rate up, first off, if you think that Jane Cox paying the babysitter above the market rate is going to raise everyone's wages, I beg to differ.
Yeah, it's probably, well, that's probably true too.
Because even the stock market, it's like, what they say, what one company does, other companies are going to learn from or whatever. And that's sort of true. But it's like we just learned last week that there's 3,500 public companies in the United States. There's some crazy amount. And it's like what one company do is not all other 3,500 companies are not going to do that unless just maybe you're like a JP Morgan or a Netflix or a Facebook. There's 50 companies that, yes, will do that have the power. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent here.
Well, I think most good financial advice probably doesn't have finances at the core of it. I mean, another thing I would think to say is everything, I think just about everything in my life is really about relationships and having a partner who understands that money is not always the most important thing about work. It is also, I think, has been crucial for me, who's someone who understands, and this goes in both directions in my marriage, that sometimes you have to do that piece of work, that job, unrelated, even when you have a child. And I will say, that has paid us back in multiple ways because we have kind of, quote unquote, allowed, if you like, each other to do things over the years that were not financially good for our family. Sometimes were actively very challenging for the family, take badly paying theater jobs while also paying babysitters a lot of money. And I feel like that has come back in positive ways, both in terms of, primarily because of building relationships with people that it mattered to build relationships with, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And also, our niece, we hired her to babysit once, and we said, "What do you want us to pay you?" And she said, "Whatever you want," right? And so we were like, "Okay, we'll just pay you what we pay our professional babysitter." And so we paid her, and she was like, "This is too much money." And we were like, for half a second, we were like, "Well, should we have paid her less because it's not her fault?" I don't know. But then we were like, "No, that's what we pay for babysitting. So that's what we're going to do."
That.
So even though I guess we could pay her less, we're like, "No, you're doing the job." And
yeah. Well, that reminds me of a piece of advice that I'm happy to have the opportunity to say out loud on your podcast, which is that, I've been blessed with being able to hire a lot of associates and assistants over the years. And I will tell you that there is one consistent difference between people who identify as men and people who identify as women, which is that men always ask about the money almost at the beginning of the conversation. And women sometimes never ask. Women will sometimes take the job without ever having asked how much it's going to pay. And the thing that I want to say to any women listening to your podcast is just know that that's only half the people that are not asking the question, I mean, maybe there's some men out there too, but I haven't yet encountered them. And that kind of fascinates me, where we are, that is still such a challenge. So women, ask how much the job pays.
Well, I will say that sometimes I feel like I'm not a man because
Because you don't.
I never, like, I know I have a podcast called Artistic Finance, right?
Yeah.
But I have it because I'm not good with all this.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
trying to learn. But even
I
this
think
job
that's
that pays six,
awesome. That's so
but
great that you take this on as a sort of means of learning. You must have learned so much by now.
you would think so, right? Right? Well, I have learned. I've learned a lot. Have I taken action on all that? That's another story. But even this academic job that pays $60,000,
Right.
I went through 3 interviews and never once asked about the salary. I had no idea.
Right.
And then finally, when it got time to where we had to talk about that, the
Right.
person was like, "Oh, so the range is 52 to 60." It was posted, I'm sure. There was multiple job postings. It was not posted.
Not
I'm sure
posted.
this person
Yeah.
knows that. I'm
Yeah.
not, you got to be careful what I put into the public. So if this person ever hears this, but it's like, I have to
Yeah.
bring that up at some point with them to be like, don't gaslight me. It was not
Right.
posted. It's very
Right.
easy to post something and you know that your job postings don't have. But anyway,
And you really need to know how much time they expect from you for that. Because if they're saying you can go out and do work, that's great. But are they really going to make that possible? It's hard.
they are not. They are
Yeah.
not. It's it's
Mhm.
we could get into this conversation.
We can talk about this
But
off air if you like.
yeah,
Happy to
but
chat.
but I do want to talk about it on air just a little
Mm.
bit because it's putting me in a situation where I then have to slack off at the $60,000 job in order
Right.
to make my living and life
Yes.
easier,
Yeah.
is what they're unofficially telling me. They're
Yes.
saying, we want
Yeah.
you to teach less
Yeah.
and go work more for your professional life, which is not fair to anybody.
No.
But
No.
anyway, so I just wanted to say that part of when you were mentioning the system, it's like this system is setting me up to either be a really good professor or be a professional worker who is also anyway.
So one thing you might try, Rachel Houck and I did this one time, and on a job which, well, I'm going to say, this was, how long ago was this? This is 15 years ago, right? And the salary was the same, but it was a $60,000 a year full-time job, and we asked if we could share it, like $30,000 each, right, and be half-time, and they went for it, and that was actually, from a financial point of view, that actually worked really well because it was sort of like this base income, but we both did have the flexibility to go and work. So maybe ask them, maybe there's someone else you want to do it with. And then you get, and that felt better in terms of this question of am I actually going to be able to make a living, doing other things as well.
That is interesting, the splitting it. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I thought we thought that was a pretty good model. We did that for a couple of years.
I think it is a good model.
But then we weren't super keen on the institution, so we left. But from a financial and practical point of view, it worked pretty well.
Well, and actually, I want to also mention, because you were like, it's 15 years ago, same salary.
Mm-hmm.
I asked the previous lighting professor who was hired 4 or 5 years ago, and it was the same salary.
Yeah.
And I was like, how is that 4 or 5 years?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I say it's the country. It's not the institutions, I don't think, theater or universities or otherwise. I think.
Oh, 100%. Well, that's another thing I also want to make sure we mention is, it's not the people. It's not this person who's deciding the salary, or it's the system. It's not the university's fault. It's not the theater department's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's not my fault for taking the job and or not taking the job.
I mean, within the theater, since I have the microphone, my biggest complaint and my biggest complaint has to do with the amount of production people want for the little money they have. I kind of feel like, okay, I completely accept that not-for-profit theaters are always on the edge of collapse. They are, all of them, even the bigger ones, pretty limited in their budget. But then be realistic about what you can have on your stages, and I think there's a gap there, or maybe not malicious gap, but unthought through. It's in the theater's interest maybe sometimes not to think it through, the gap between what they can afford to put on the stage from the point of view of physical production and how much they can spend on it. So, one rule I've always had about freelance designing, and I don't have an exact ratio, but think hard about the ratio between what they're willing to pay you and how much money is in the budget for stuff. Because if they're happy to spend $80,000 on stuff, but your fee is like $6,000, then something's really wrong in the priority of the theater. And if you bring that up, people will say, oh, well, that's what it costs. Designers always want more stuff. They're going to ask for more. They'll try to sort of stick it back on the creative team. And they're not wrong that the creative team will push for more. But I feel like it's really important for a theater to lay out its priorities in how those two numbers stack up against each other. Like, I would rather we paid designers a living wage to make the best possible use of 6 Fresnels.
I totally agree. All right. So we've talked about a good financial thing, which is, I loved that answer. What is a bad financial thing that you've done that maybe other people could learn from or try not to do?
Okay. Don't put your student loan repayments on a credit card. I think I already covered that. I'm not going to go out there and tell people that they should default on their student loans, but I'm just going to say a number of people that I went to school with, faced with a similar situation, made that choice. And 10 years later, we're in a financially better place than I was. I don't know. It's changed. It's all changed so much since I was dealing with it. So, but look really carefully at the ways in which you can put off or cut back or, manage your student loans in other ways than putting them on a credit card. That's probably obvious to anyone listening to this podcast but me. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I would say, if you're a freelancer, pay your quarterly taxes. Like the first, okay, you asked me what's the worst financial, the second stupidest thing I've ever done financially was like, for many years, I didn't really earn enough money to pay taxes. So when the tax bill came at the end of the year, it was negligible, really, because I wasn't making enough money for many years. It was whatever the threshold is for paying taxes. I was barely cracking it for many years. And then I had a kid. And we just start making more money. And my husband is also a freelance artist, but in more commercial arenas than mine. There was 1 year early on, we were paying for like preschool, and we did not pay quarterly taxes because we literally couldn't figure out how to do it, and pay for the preschool and the babysitters. And then at the end of the year, we got the most insane tax bill because we had both been working almost exclusively on 1099. So I would say, like, if I could go back in time, I mean, we dug ourselves out of that one, but it took a few years. We had to make an installment plan with the government that went on for several years. And it all worked out in the end. But like, that was really stressful and unnecessarily stressful. Like, I think if we had been thinking a little harder, but we were sleep deprived. We had a toddler.
So you had been paying quarterly and then you stopped during the preschool time?
I think probably my husband, my current husband, had been paying quarterly taxes in his life. I had made so little money most of the time, and then I would, for several years, I had like bits and pieces of teaching work on W-2s, and I would just have them pay take out the max amount of taxes, and that was basically covering it. So it hadn't super come up for me.
That is the story of the freelancer. Every W-2, take as much taxes as possible.
Take
please.
it all. Just take it all. So, yeah.
Okay, but I just wanted to make the point that the reason to pay the quarterly taxes that you're saying is because if you don't, at the end of the year, you're going to have to pay a lot.
It's not like they go away.
Yeah. But it's not because they find you or anything like that to be like, you didn't make your quarterly payments. It was more for you of, now I have to pay a ton of money.
At the end of the year, then we sat down and did our taxes and realized that we owed, I don't remember, but like, $20,000 or something, like some figure that was just sort of completely out of reach. And we were like, oh, it. And there was a kind of triple whammy at the time too of, and I don't know how much this has changed, but like you were renting, not owning, right? So there were no deductions there. You had your own business, quote unquote, in New York City, which is, I don't know exactly what the tax rate is, but adding them all up together, the tax rate came close to 50%. It's shocking, really, because the tax rate on my income now, which is substantially more than it ever was as a freelancer, is lower because I'm not paying self-employment tax. And I mean, it's kind of staggering how this country is set up to kind of screw people who are sort of, low to middle income freelancers.
That's going to be the title of this episode. America is out to screw people.
Are they going to kick me out of the country, Ethan, after I do this podcast?
Jane, 10 years ago, I would have said no. But today, I can't answer that question for you. Maybe they will.
I know. This will be on your conscience.
See, I would not be surprised if next week it's like, any Irish immigrants, even if they have citizenship, even if they have children that were born here, they all have to go back to Ireland. I wouldn't be surprised.
Especially if they badmouth the capitalist system on air.
Yeah, maybe only. Unless they're Republican or something. Yeah. That's it for part 1 of this interview. My takeaways are taking out a $50,000 loan for grad school and sort of thinking they know I'm not going to be able to pay this back. I think that's very funny, but it's also sort of true and relatable. Something that frightens me about that $50,000 number is, one, with interest, it's exponentially so much more. But also $50,000 doesn't actually sound that crazy today. And that's weird. Anyway, making a financially successful career in lighting is possible, but not so much in making a career in theater lighting design. I love that Jane said that because it makes it not controversial. And tied into that, awareness of the financial system working against theater design as a career. So financially, are we crazy to work in theater as designers? The answer is yes. Financially, logically, yes. But I love Jane's take on it that there are ways to work things out. Like her idea of splitting a $60,000 salary into 2, so that way you have more time flexibility. That was wonderful. Taking an academic job, that was wonderful. And something that I'm experiencing right now, which is the ebb and flow of a career. There's a natural tide to the work. You can go whole hog into it, or you can pull back. But once a lighting designer, always a lighting designer. The didn't get into Yale Mafia. I love this. All right, so if you're listening and you applied to Yale and were rejected, you are part of the didn't get into Yale Mafia. If you are listening and you did get into Yale, please let's not discuss anything right now and please step away. If you're listening and you didn't apply to Yale, then unfortunately you cannot be a part of this mafia. So you thought being a part of the artistic finance community was a special club, and it is. But now there seems to be an even specialer club called the Didn't Get Into Yale Mafia. I love it. All right, paying student loans with a credit card. We sort of glossed over that. Yes, we said don't do it and look for other ways to sort of manage that. And I just have to agree with that. Like, set up a payment plan, but don't pay them off using the credit card because the amount of interest is so much greater with a credit card. So you're making a bad thing worse. I'm not saying to default on your student loans, if that's even legal. I Googled it and it's sort of legal, but also, anyway, do your due diligence on that. So I'm not saying default on them, and nor was Jane, but do know that that's an option to pursue. But we would rather, I'm not saying don't pay them, but pay as little as possible, but don't rack up credit card debt for your student loans. And Jane says it seems obvious, but You never know. A lot of us are so responsible. We want to pay our bills and all this that I could see us going into more debt trying to pay the debt. I also love that Jane mentioned budgeting when you need to, not necessarily all the time, but when there are lean times or when you're trying to figure it out, pull out that budget and figure it out because the numbers don't lie. Sort of a repeat theme here, which is being good with money is only possible when you have money. So just because you don't have it doesn't mean that you don't understand math. Yeah, we all sort of know how it is, and we work with budgets and we work with numbers and we know how it is. You just have to have that income so that you can manage things and be quote unquote good with money. Community, prioritizing the needs of the community in terms of sort of what the community needs to thrive, not just doing the bare minimum that the market rate claims that the community needs, but actually looking at what do these people that I'm hiring need and or what are they asking for and how can I make that happen, even if it's not the news that I want to hear or if it's not the money I want to pay. I appreciate that perspective because it includes all the non-financial things that are tied in with paying for goods and services. So we can be in capitalism in the United States, and we can still be moral or at least infuse our morality or our positive energy into our relationships that include money. Paying quarterly taxes, it pops up again as a good thing to be doing. And what was interesting is that tax rate of 50%. Jane was saying that as a freelancer, when she was stacking things together, that the tax rate was sort of 50%. And then that went down once she went full on to W-2. I suspect everyone listening doesn't have a tax rate as high as 50%, but certainly 30% if you're a freelancer is a possibility. And it's that reminder to make sure you're saving that much money so that way you have that to pay your taxes or you're paying them quarterly. So you've already taken care of it when it comes around to filing your taxes at the end of the year. All right, that's it for my takeaways. If you want to hear the rest of the interview, you can do that by signing up to be a patron. Patrons all get early releases and they get ad-free episodes. And that is at patreon.com/artisticfinance. If you are a patron, I want to say thank you so much for being so. If you're not a patron, you can sign up again at patreon.com/artisticfinance. Okay, now I mentioned I was going to talk about producing an off-Broadway play in September. That play is called False Steps, a ballroom comedy. And go figure, it is a high-energy comedy that has about 6 ballroom dances thrown into the plot. It's pretty amazing. Now, I am currently an associate producer on the production, and what that means is that I need to raise $50,000 by August. I do want to mention that there is no financial incentive for me for raising this money. What it does is it keeps me in the producer room and in the producer meetings. Now, if I can't find investors to put that money into this show, it's not a big deal in the sense that I still will be working on the production as the lighting designer, but I will get removed from the associate producer role, which means I won't get to attend the producer meetings or talk with them about that. And I'm not going to get a behind the scenes look at the financials, which will be sad to me if and when the show goes on to a commercial run, hopefully Broadway, because then I would be behind the scenes on that journey as well. So all this to say, if you are interested in investing, I would love for you to join me on that journey. So anyway, I have been looking for people to invest $12,500, but I did learn this week that people can come in underneath that minimum investment unit. So if you have $5,000 that you can live without, that can be put into this show. All right, now I better stop talking about it because I could talk about it forever. But moral of the story, if you are interested in investing in an off-Broadway show, reach out to me. Easiest way is artisticfinancepodcast@gmail.com, and I will share more details with you. All right, the dad joke to end the episode is a quote from the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Every triangle is a love triangle when you love triangles. That's it for today. Until next time, break a leg.
Thank you for listening to Artistic Finance, where we interview successful artists, leaders, and investors to help educate and inspire the creative community. To access our show notes and resources, go to artisticfinance.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Artistic Finance. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.